All right, we got it. Let me make sure the volume is off and then we'll get started. Okay, we're ready to go. So probably one of the videos that I am going to show this coming Wednesday is one that deals with neurology. What we have seen in the past several decades within the area of social psychology and even in sociology is testing really what areas of the brain are associated with different sociological mechanisms. One of those is, of course, love, attraction, mate selection, why it is that we choose one certain person over another, why it is that we want to be with this one person. And it is important to say that emotions do play a role. And we'll get to emotions and mate selection and attraction at a later time. But the thing that I want us to understand at this moment is the association between brain mechanisms and attraction and love. Because this has been an interesting finding over the probably the last 2 decades and a half. When we put people in an MRI machine and we show them, and they come into the MRI, they say, hey, this person, I'm completely, totally in love with them. And we can measure them at the beginning, we can measure them at 20, 30 years later. And we want to know kind of what areas of their brain light up when they're thinking about that person that they're completely and totally in love with. Okay. And so originally, when we did these studies, every theory on falling in love with someone or intimate relationships were an emotionally based theory. And what we assumed is that when we put people in these MRI machines, which measures the activity of the brain, is that the emotional areas of the brain would light up. So it would be the limbic amygdala, it would be the hippocampal area, it would be the paralimbic area, all of those areas that are associated with emotions, or something that we call serotonin areas of the brain, those areas of the brain that deal with our emotional well-being. And that's what we assumed would light up. But it's interesting because the areas of the brain that light up when we're looking at pictures of that person that we measured really high in with romantic love, that person I truly care about, that person that I obsess about, the emotional area of the emotional areas of the brain, excuse me, barely light up at all. Yes, there is some activity, but it's not the most reactive area of the brain. The most reactive areas of the brain when it comes to someone you've fallen in love with are the brainstem and a paralimbic area that deals with dopamine. Okay, now let me explain this. Your brainstem deals with every drive you have as a human being. So your need for food, water, warmth, shelter, well, all of those areas that are automatic processes that are necessary for human survival. That is one area that lights up. The other area is what we call the dopaminergic area, and it is the reward center. It is what makes us addicted to something. It's what happens when we win first place in a event. It's what happens when you get an A in a class. It's that area that says, yes, that's what I want, and I want more of it. So these are the areas that when we fall in love with someone, it is the drive centers of the area, and it is the motivational areas of the brain. The emotional areas of the brain light up a little. The issue that we have with this, and this is something that we need to have a good conversation about, is as human beings, we don't have much control over the dopamine and the brain stem areas of the brain. Hence, most of the modern theories on falling in love and everything explain a whole bunch of things that we don't understand. For example, when we lose someone we love, we go through this period of almost starvation, of thirst, and we do very irrational things to try and regain that love or that emotion, quote unquote, that they provided. Indeed, if we look at what happens when people get rejected or they get dumped, it is the same exact thing that happens when a person is going through starvation or thirst or is being deprived of oxygen. Because we're learning that it's that area of the brain that is active during that moment, and it's being reinforced by this dopamine system that is saying, this is what this human needs. This is what this person needs, whether they're good for us or they're bad for us. And so I want to make this preference up front. The system is not a rational system. This system has nothing to do with your higher cortical areas of the brain that makes you add 2 + 2 = 4. This really has nothing to do with the emotional area of the brain that tells you whether or not something is dangerous or not dangerous for you. And that's what the amygdala, the emotional area of the brain, does if we give it the right terminology in the beginning. So I want to start with this irrationality about attraction, mate selection, and falling in love, because it's an important conversation to have. Anyone that has been in a bad relationships understand this. Anyone that has been in a long-term wonderful relationship will understand this. It has less to do with emotion, more to do with human drives. And so this is something that Fisk, 2013, this individual, Susan Fisk, is the one that did many of the groundbreaking MRI studies that we have done, many of the things that understand what part of our brain actually activates when we see pictures of the person that we are deeply in love with versus a picture of a rock or something else. She said, attraction impels one person to seek another, and attraction changes lives. Okay, so let's explore this a little bit more. Attraction, as a definition, so this is just going to be our working definition, concerns a desire for a voluntary relationship, which we do have to question the word voluntary, to sustain because the participant enjoys each other. Okay, so the issues that we do need to raise based on current research and current things is, yes, we can agree on the second statement after the comma that says sustained because participants enjoy each other. But the other part is a concern, a desire for voluntary relationship. So I just want to mention what is meant by voluntary relationship. And the brainstem does hunger, which gives us what our cravings are, which is the food that we'll seek out. So a lot of us think voluntary relationships or voluntary food is that I enjoy Mexican food over American food. I enjoy Chinese over barbecue. I choose this over that. And we think we make that cognitive decision that we're choosing voluntarily the food to eat. But the complicated part of that is dependent upon how we were raised, determines the food we like and we enjoy. If we're raised on a non-spicy food, as adults, we'll be less likely to enjoy that spicy food. If we're raised on barbecue versus Chinese, as adults, we'll have a preference for that barbecued over the Chinese food. Because what is being made here is the associations between what has sustained me as a child, the flavors that have come out, the things that I know about, and the unfamiliar. And so when we talk about a voluntary relationship, we have to take into account our learned history about relationships, about food, about whether we prefer water versus Gatorade. Personally, I'll take a diet soda over water any day because what I was raised on was not water, it was diet soda. And so that's the example that we have here. And I don't know if I mentioned this in my classes before and everything, but a lot of women who were survivors of domestic violence, and they tended to continue to get in and out of those domestic violence relationships, tended to have a child history of their parents doing domestic violence with each other and having that experience early in childhood. And with those children, what do we find is a mismatch between what is love versus what is pain. And those children in those early years tend to label pain for love and love for pain. Just like preferences for Mexican food versus barbecued food. And so when they become adults, they'll have a preference for that pain because that is their primary drive versus that preference for something that is unusual, that is foreign to them. And then again, they question whether they should, what they should do. And in some of these cases, when they were ready and I was their counselor or person working with them and they got out of the relationship and they said, hey, I'm ready to get into another relationship. I crave it. I want it. And we would start with this preference. Get in a relationship with someone you're not comfortable with. Someone that you don't crave, that if you crave the Mexican food, go for the barbecue instead. And yes, this will take time, it'll take evolution, but in many of the successful cases that I've had, the individual, they'll come back and they'll admit, it took me a year, it took me 2 years to fall in love with this person. But since then, we've had a healthy relationship. Our children are doing good. I'm doing good. Everything is good because I didn't do that primary craving that I went for. And so when we talk about voluntary, we have to realize that's our frontal cortex trying to take over and justify those primitive drives we have for what we've learned. So let's keep that in mind as we move along. And this slide kind of brings up kind of what I've been talking about to this point when it comes to human intimate relationships. We have that primary affect, that spinal cord, that brainstem reaction of liking or not liking another person. And then we have the cognition. This is a person I like. This is a person I enjoy. I enjoy the conversation. And then we have the behavior, our tendency to avoid those individuals who don't give us that primary affect, don't give us that justification for why we like them. And so we avoid those individuals. And this is the complexity of human attraction. Is there's the biological, here, let's highlight this. There's a biological aspect from our learned history, what foods we like and don't like. Then we have the justification. Well, I like barbecue because I was raised in the South. I like barbecue because that's what my family always made. I like barbecue for this reason, and I avoid Chinese because, you know, the noodle textures and all the rice textures are just off for me. And so we justify this initial affective response. And then what is our behaviors? It's for us to seek out those individuals who fulfill those cognitive and affective needs. So we avoid, and I'm going to bring the food example in, we avoid the Chinese and we're attracted towards the barbecue food. And we justify, and then that behavior then justifies our affect and our cognition, because guess what? We work harder at those relationships, which then reinforce our primary thoughts and reinforce the things that are happening in our brainstem. So it's a cycle that we need to deal with. And I'm going to say this, not all of these cycles, I came out of when I went into academia, I dealt with this on the domestic violence level and when people are horrible with each other. I'm going to say this does not represent all of those relationships. There are people where the system works perfectly. About 40% of our population right now, this system works perfectly. It sustains our population from an evolutionary perspective. And even on the dysfunctional level, it supports the evolutionary, because those people who have the dysfunctional affect and cognition, they're still having children. And so from an evolutionary perspective, both routes work. So I just want to mention that as we move forward. So some things that are consistent. We have to look at the biological genetic evolutionary perspectives that we just talked about. So we have to look at that. And then, of course, for our sociology class, one of the more big important ones is our social shared norms. What is it that is appropriate for me as an individual, given my ethnicity, given my culture, given my race? What is it that is appropriate? My religion, my everything. What is it appropriate for me to mate with or to fall in love with? And then we definitely, because this is one of the biggest variables, is idiosyncratic preferences. This is on the individual level. From you viewing individuals, despite your genetics, despite your social norms, on an individual level, what is your idiosyncratic preference? And this probably is best represented in the LGBTQ communities, because social norms in culture, in most cultures across the world, is that a male and female become in love and they procreate. And so that's the social norm. The biological and genetic propensity is that my job here on Earth is to pass on my genetic information. It's about, and that's what we assume with evolution. But on an idiosyncratic level, on an individual level, this varies. And so we see individuals who are LGBTQ who may not meet the social norm or might not meet the evolutionary idea of procreation. And I can explain this actually on an evolutionary level of why our genetics, why people with who are LGBTQ state they were always like this. Okay, they always had this preference for the same sex and whatnot. It's very simple, is that as that we see LGBTQ across the species, especially when a species gets to what's called a critical mass, meaning that if that species procreates anymore, they will take away all of the resources that are available, and that species will no longer exist. And when we think about the human race, we're at something billion people, and the resources are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And so even from an evolutionary perspective, we can see that this idiosyncratic preference for who we fall in love with is supported. And so I just want to bring that idea up, that yes, social shared norms, your religious beliefs, your social norms about who can be married, who cannot be married, the idea behind evolution and procreation, they all play a role. But this idiosyncratic preference also plays a large role, especially when it comes to individual attraction. Okay. So I want to talk about 3 principles of attraction that we have found across psychological studies and sociological studies. These tend to be fairly consistent, but I am going to say this does not apply to everybody. Human attraction is very diverse. The first principle of attraction is familiarity. So there are some people who are completely attracted to strangers. They have a sexual preference. They want to be involved with someone who is not like them. And once they find out that that person has some similarities, they dump them right away. So that's diversity within this principle of attraction. But for the most part, birds with the same feather tend to flock together. Okay, and this is the principle of familiarity. Is that we tend to be attracted to strangers, to people who tend to have our similar ideas, even when we come into a novel person who we may not know nothing about. Because our first and basic reaction should be safety. So when a new person enters our life, we're kind of like, I need to check this person out. I need to withhold judgment. I need to make sure I'm okay. But then there's something called the mere exposure effect, which we talked about with the social identity and theory idea. is that over time, when we're exposed to a person, we tend to like them more. This then leads to familiarity, where we come across an individual like this that we've been exposed to over time. They feel familiar to us. And so there's some type of attraction. Okay. And this even goes back to when I work with survivors of domestic violence who tended to get in and out of relationships. Is yes, novel person. This, in this case, probably an abusive person. In the initial stages of their relationship, this person is very matches what the person expected with what they learned about love and caring from their youth. And then over mere exposure, they tend to use this person as their model for adult relationships. So when they come across a person like this creates familiarity and it creates attraction. Hence, Mark Twain once famously said, familiarity breeds contempt and children. So, and he was going with this kind of thought process of, wow, so if we're not around the right people, especially through young developmental stages into the adolescent stages, it can breed both contempt and it breeds both children. Okay. The other principle of attraction is we tend to be attracted to people who have similar qualities than we do. I do want to say, so the picture is funny because these two obviously like each other. But similarity is about values, belief systems, ideas, religion, whether we're going to be a conservative or a liberal, a Republican or a Democrat. Republicans tend to be more attracted towards other Republicans. Democrats tend to be attracted to more Democrats. On the race and ethnicity level, we tend to be more attracted towards individuals who are in our same race or ethnicity. And all of those levels, as intellectual levels. And this tends to be a consistent theme that we see. And a lot of people have said in the years that I've taught this class and taught this this thing, is said, but wait a minute, my husband or my boyfriend or my girlfriend or my wife has this idea, this belief that is different than mine. Maybe it's how they raise their children, or so maybe one is a disciplinary where the other one is a more democratic parent who wants a child to have more say in what they're doing. But when you look at those situations deeper, while their behaviors towards the child may be different, their belief value system may be completely the same, such as we want to raise respectful, caring people. One does it through discipline, the other does it through conversation and positive interactions with the child. But the belief system that supports how that child will be reared is the same. That they want to have a child who is respectful and a productive citizen in society. So different behaviors, same belief. And this is the principle of similarity. The third principle of attraction is reciprocity. I'm sorry, I can't say that very well on a Monday night. But it's the idea of tit versus tat. You give, I give. So it's the idea that you want to know we are liked and thought well of, therefore positive attention leads to greater attention. Okay. And again, we have to look at the role of culture, because reciprocity does not mean equality. It doesn't mean that one person has more investment than it's not about the same investment. So I want to bring culture into this role. If the cultural expectation is that the woman is home, and I'll use this term, barefoot and pregnant, and the man is outside the home doing what he wants and providing for the family, but both are contributing equally, but one is seen less than the other. This, in a situation of reciprocity, where there's appreciation for each other's roles based on the cultural expectations, can lead to attraction. Your expectations of what you want out of your relationship is what leads to this. So if you want that, in the stereotypical, the man who provides, you want the king of the house, you want to be the individual who provides services to that individual in the very stereotypical way, that is reciprocity in that situation. Okay, but there is some things that we need to qualify for this last principle of attraction. Okay, is one, we have to remember the laws of operant conditioning. If you weren't appreciated for your behaviors in the past, and that person that you're with starts to reward you for that, or vice versa, that's not reciprocity, because your learned behaviors are not consistent with your current experiences. The other issue is authentic congruency, and this goes into too much leads to motive seeking. So with authentic congruency, so maybe, I don't know if anyone in the class has ever had this, but they've had this person from maybe a dating app and everything else, and you wake up and that person says you're beautiful. At noon, they say you're beautiful. At 5, when you're worn out and you're exhausted, they say you're a kind person, and you're beautiful. At night, when you're going to bed with your, your robe and all your makeup off, and they say you're beautiful. And there's this incongruency between what they say and your experience. This is when this law, this principle of attraction goes away. Because what people often do when there's that constant person saying, giving you those positive qualities, even when you know you're not having a positive quality, is we tend to do something called motive seeking. What is this person want out of me? Why are they not being congruent with the experiences that I'm having? There's something wrong with this individual. They want something out of me. Okay, so this law has these two important howevers. That one, it has to be consistent with what we have been rewarded for and punished for, and two, it has to be authentic. It has to be wake up in the morning and say, how are you? And say, I hope you have a nice day. Both of us should, get cleaned up, blah, blah, blah. It's at the end of the day when we know they've been stressed, and we can say, I can tell that you're in this mood, in this situation, and being, the word honest, instead of seeking that approval from that individual, or seeking this alternative motive behind this person by not being authentic. Okay, so that is the third principle. It has some qualifiers with it that we should note that are important. Okay, so now let's talk about the role of physical appearance. I've been asked, how long does it take, or I've asked classes, how long does it take for you to decide you like someone or dislike someone? And the answer is 1.5 seconds. Okay, I'm going to state this again. When you first interact with someone, what's going to predict whether you like that person or dislike that person in some future appearance with that person occurs in 1.5 seconds. We call this the first impression. We call this the first thing. When you go to an interview for work, this law predicts this. If those people don't like you within the first 1.5 seconds, regardless of your qualifications, you're probably not going to get that job. All right. So when we talk about physical appearance, we need to understand the automatic processes that are at play. Those automatic processes occur within 1.5 seconds. And then we go through the justification phase. Well, I don't like this applicant because I don't think that that applicant will fit well with our organization. I realize that person has all the qualifications we're looking for, but I don't feel the vibe from that applicant. And you know what? She expressed some different moral values that I think what we have for this organization. And that's the decision to engage. But remember, this is a 1.5 second decision. And we think, because we're higher cognitive beings, that we make this decision over time. But if we look at the predictive value of the first 1.5 seconds, it predicts anything better than religious similarities, physical similarities, cultural similarities, any of those values that you hold tight to yourself. If those aren't picked up in the first 1.5 seconds, you will justify a reason not to like that person. And this is the role of physical appearance. So let's talk about this. So positive quality, physical qualities, positive qualities. We do have this fallacy about the stereotype of the perfect physical person. And these stereotypes have changed over time. So for example, Marilyn Monroe, who has been said to be the most beautiful person in American culture, in the United States culture, would have not met that standard today. She would have been seen as overweight. She would have been seen as sluggish. She would have not met the qualities that we see physical appearance as today. So let's look at this, because this is a fallacy. We assume that physical qualities equals positive qualities. So people who are tall, thin, equals smart, intelligent, and we do this cycle with each of these. So let's look at some of these fortunes of being more physically attractive, which in today is thin, tall, and those types of things. They tend to be more confident, more sexually experienced, and across cultures, dependent upon the stereotype that culture has for physical attraction, they tend to be more successful, treated more fairly, and children receive preferential treatment. And we could even look at this on the male end. So before the advent of the refrigerator, before the advent of being able to store food and all of those things that came in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, what was seen as a good male quality is a male that was chubby, who had girth, who had a hang over his belt, those men were seen as more attractive, because what that meant is they had access to things that the skinny, scrawny guys didn't have, which is food, quality food, all of those types of things. Okay. But now if we look at today, you look at an overweight male or female, and you instantly think obesity crisis, diabetes, those kinds of things. But under 120 years ago, they're the kind of people that you would see on the cover of Penthouse and male stripper magazines, or in a male stripper club. You would have not seen the chiseled, strong, tall guys we see today. Okay, and this is what I mean about across cultures, that depended upon the time and the health that we see certain people are at, are what give this physical attraction. So again, over 120 years ago, a guy who was skinny and what we would say is healthy today died at a younger age because he didn't have access to nutrition. And same with females. But now today, with our overnutrition society, if you're overweight, you tend to be seen as obese, diabetic, all of these negative worldly things that that we didn't think about, years ago, when it was the bigger people who lived longer than the skinnier people. So I do want to talk about universals of attractiveness. Again, this does not meet everybody's preferences. Remember, at the beginning of this lecture, we talked about idiosyncratic preferences. Okay, so these are just things we tend to find across culture. So let's start with males. Males across culture tend to see signs of youth, such as clear skins, sign of health, such as absence of sores, large wide eyes, and small noses, prominent cheekbones, are all signs of what we call cross-cultural universalities. Okay. Now, again, we got to take in the whole slim, weighted, all of those kinds of things when it comes to the idiosyncratic things. But what we do find is when we manipulate women's faces, men tend to find this type of feature more attractive on average. There is one universal between both men and women, and that's facial symmetry. So in this picture, this is this guy's actual face. And then this is when we correct it using computers. So this is this person's very human face, but you'll notice one eyebrow is set above the other. It's asymmetrical, okay? And when we show these pictures to women and whatnot, we find that women will rate this computer-generated face that symmetrizes the individual's face versus the real face that lacks that symmetry, okay? And there's three kind of main theories that tries to explain this. One is the asymmetric argument. So when we look at artwork, people tend to be attracted and find artwork that is more symmetrical in nature. So if you were to put that painting in half, such as the Mona Lisa, and they were both of equal quality, we find that more aesthetic. We find that more pleasing. The other argument is a familiarity argument, that one side of the face is non-familiar than the other, and so we get back to that principle of familiarity. But I think the one that probably is more into this is more of the biological explanation, and that's the asymmetry theory. Is what we find is the more asymmetric the face becomes, we find more developmental issues, so they're more likely to have a developmental dysfunction and intellectual disorder. They tend to be less fertile, so they tend not to be able to impregnate or become pregnant as quick. And they have slower growth rates and poorer survival rates than people who have more symmetrical faces. So there's the biological end that I think kind of fits that aesthetic familiarity argument, that again, we're looking at this from a reproductive perspective, and we're looking at which is going to give me the best option for offspring in the future. And we find the more asymmetric the face is, the less likely that becomes. So we look at those factors. So let's talk about some very universal attractiveness for men, and we can do these down to 3 qualities. Youthfulness, as we've explained before, good health, and fertility. In fact, there's an equation for this. We tend to find that when the waist-hip ratio is closer to 0.70, regardless of the woman's weight size, men across cultures tend to find that woman more attractive. Okay, so this is whether we're measuring a woman who is very skinny versus a woman who is very heavy or more girth. If it's closer to this equation, we find men find these women more attractive. Okay, now what's also important about this equation goes to the fertility thing, is that we find that women who are closer to this waist-hip ratio also are more likely to survive birth, give life to birth, so that it's less likely of a stillbirth or death during birth or any of those types of issues. We find that women who are more close to this ratio tend to be able to be impregnated quicker if all the other aspects of pregnancy are in place, or impregnation is in place. So this ratio tends to fit within that, okay? So these tend to be kind of men's universals. But again, there's great diversity in this, and I want to make sure this is very clear. We've got to take in the socialization of these things. This tends to just be kind of that average finding we have. So now what about women? There tends to be a few more things that women look for than men do. Youthfulness, that ratio, all those things, a guy will be okay on average. But what are some things that women look for when it comes to attraction? Well, we know the face plays a very, very important role in female attraction towards men. And so let's go through a few of these. First, let's go through cues of dominance. So we can take women who want the caring, lovable family man who is sensitive. And then we can take some male who is completely dominant, indifferent, and everything to the female. And if we show pictures of those two individuals, women will rate the dominant face, the dominant man, as more attractive than the sensitive man, regardless of what they're looking for. Okay. The next one is deep voice rather than high-pitched voice. And this was actually done in a very funny kind of UK sitcom kind of thing, where they had women come and they were supposed to rate the attractiveness of the male who's behind the screen, who's both going to read the same poem to the woman, and the woman is supposed to rate the male's attractiveness. So in some cases, it would be the ocean is like ending something, blah, 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 in a very high voice, versus listening to a high pitched voice of the ocean is and blah, blah, blah. And before revealing the person, they would, they would say, so who do you think is behind this curtain? And with a low voice, the women would describe them as muscular, strong, probably very virile, very, just very masculine. And with a high voice, they would probably a wimp, maybe overweight, maybe too skinny, probably doesn't take control of stuff, doesn't do this, doesn't do that. And then I want to bring in physiology. The more weight a man has, the more testosterone that male has. Testosterone determines deepness of voice. So men who tend to be heavy set tend to have a low pitched voice. Men who work out all the time, who have a very low fat ratio, who are chiseled, who are that, because they don't have as much testosterone, they tend to have a high pitched voice. And so they would do the curtain, and they, the deep voice guy would, oh, yeah, here I am. And the high pitched voice, who was the chiseled one. And it would just kind of, in what the TV show it is looking at the reaction of the female and seeing the differential between their social expectation versus the physiological truth. And what's funny about this is that it seems to be testosterone that drives that influence. So this is good dating advice for the guys who have low-pitched voice but may not fit the social stereotype. Call your date before you meet your date. Use that deep voice that you naturally have. Get her on that level before you meet her physically. It'll increase your chances very well. Just putting that out there for any of the guys in the class who need some dating advice. Okay. We do find across cultures some issues dealing with stereotypical faces. So I'll give some examples. So the jotted jaw, more angular faces, this craggy eye. These guys, when again we present pictures of less angular, more circular faces, less jotted jaws, so they have that narrow jaws, and they don't have that 100-yard stare with the craggy eye, tend to be found as less attractive than their counterparts. Okay, so there's that stereotype face. The next one is fads are important, and this one needs to be qualified. I know we're getting near our time, so I'll try to wrap this up. Is fads are important. This does not mean that the male or female needs to wear what's popular in New York or France or, all those places where all these fashion shows take places. This one needs to be qualified. Fads are important based on the local culture that you're in. So if in your culture, the more successful people tend to be wearing t-shirts and jeans versus three-piece suits, you're more likely to be attracted to the guy with the t-shirt and jeans. You put a person in that culture that is wearing the three-piece suit, they're less likely to get any attention from people in that local area. And same thing if you go to a place where, people need to wear the three-piece suits, the $3,000 outfits and all of those things. And we show up, or I would show up in my, jeans and t-shirt or whatever. I'm less likely to get any attention in that area than if I stayed in the local community or wherever I came from. I'm very thankful that I met my wife's local fad. I hope and continue to hope I do that. And I don't underdo it or overdo it. I do hope that that continues. And then the last thing for females tend to be visual cues, influences, other sensation. And so this brings in the issue of smell. Smell is very important for females, but it may not be in the direction that you think it is in. And so I want to bring up one of the most interesting studies dealing with smell. So we took a group of, we took some shirts, some jerseys from a sports team that had never been worn before. They came fresh from the factory. We washed them, dried them so they didn't have that factory smell. And then we took shirts from a sports team who just worked out, they sweated, they did everything in it, and we took those without washing them. Then we put women in a booth, either with the new, freshly laundered, no smell shirts, or in the booth with a man's sweat. And most people would be thinking, oh my God, I want to be in that booth and whatnot. But let's see what happens. We showed the same visual men in both booths. And you would think in the freshly laundered one, women would be like rating those same men more attractive than in the stinky booth. But we actually found the opposite. That when there was a man's sweat scent, women tend to judge those individuals as more attractive than the freshly laundered. Now, I'm going to say this is why I think a lot of both men and women find pro athletes and athletes very attractive. They see them sweat, they see them all this. But what actually explains this more than anything, because further research was done, is when a man sweats, he sweats testosterone as part of the chemicals. And we have found that instead of using sweaty t-shirts, if we use the intensity of testosterone smell, this predicts this effect even more. Hence, if you notice, a lot of male perfumes smell a little bit like car oil and those types of chemicals. It's because those smells are more close to the smell of testosterone than, say, the pleasant smell of Gain or those other smells. Just kind of an interesting thing. So now let's end tonight with, we talked about mere exposure, we talked about height, religion, intelligence, fair and equitable distribution of resources, which I'm going to get to next time. But what I want to talk about is and so we'll end with this tonight because we're getting near our time, is what are some cross-cultural findings that we find for both men and women, despite the results that we have found, okay? We have found across cultures for both men and women, kindness and loyalty as the top two. You be nice to me, you commit to me, I will be attracted to you for the most part. The other thing is emotional stability. So the more consistent the person is with their emotions, the more likely men and women will be attracted. Okay. Some other things for men, we've already talked about this, youthfulness and physical appearance. For women, we find status, resources, acquisitions of education, earning potential, ambition tend to be cross-cultural. Issues with And I'm going to end with this one. I'll come to the personal ads on Wednesday. I do want to end with this very interesting analysis because there has been an analysis. I don't know if it's on. We'll get to this on Wednesday. So there has been an analysis by a lot of feminist groups that as female power, which I'll represent with this red line, increase, and I'm going to represent this next line, is that the assumption among many feminist groups is as female power increases, the need for a powerful man will decrease. That as we become more independent, we become more all this, that our need for that mate on a female end will decrease, that power. But in reality, what we'll find, and we'll do this with the yellow line, is that as female power increases, the need for a man with power increases exponentially. That indeed, as more power a woman needs at this point, the more powerful a man that individual needs. And indeed, if you'll notice, maybe I should circle this with a different block. Let me do this in purple. If you notice that the most equitable point a man and a woman are is when both individuals are in a low power status. That when two individuals meet based on power, the lower status power they have, the more attracted they'll be with each other. The more power they increase, the more difference in power that they need from their partner. So when we look at equitability based on power, it is actually these individuals that tend to be more equitable. And as our power increase, our inequitability increases. And that's an interesting thought that I want to leave you all with tonight. So I'm going to mute